The frozen Delaware River stretched before them like a sheet of black glass, its surface broken only by the chunks of ice that threatened to crush their makeshift boats. General George Washington stood at the bow of the lead vessel, his weathered face illuminated by the pale moonlight of December 26, 1776. Behind him, 2,400 Continental soldiers huddled against the bitter cold, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The fate of the American Revolution hung in the balance, and Washington knew that failure meant not just defeat, but the complete collapse of their cause. The situation had become desperate following the disastrous retreat across New Jersey. British forces under General William Howe had pursued the Continental Army relentlessly, forcing Washington's men to abandon fort after fort. Morale had plummeted to dangerous levels, with enlistments set to expire at year's end. Many soldiers had already deserted, leaving behind only the most determined patriots. The army that had once numbered in the tens of thousands now consisted of fewer than 3,000 effective men, poorly equipped and facing a harsh winter without adequate supplies. According to historical accounts from the National Archives, Washington understood that bold action was required to revive the revolutionary cause. The successful crossing of the Delaware and subsequent victory at Trenton had provided a much-needed morale boost. But the general knew that one victory would not be sufficient. The British still maintained strong positions throughout New Jersey, and their professional army remained largely intact. Something more dramatic was needed to convince both his own men and potential foreign allies that the American cause was still viable. Intelligence reports had revealed that British forces were consolidated in several key positions, including Princeton, where a significant garrison under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood had established winter quarters. The town's strategic location made it a crucial target, as its capture would disrupt British supply lines and potentially open the route to New Brunswick, where substantial enemy stores were housed. Washington's spies had also reported that the British believed the Continental Army was too weakened to mount any significant offensive operations. The plan that emerged from Washington's councils of war was audacious in its scope and timing. Rather than attempting a direct assault on Princeton, which would have been suicidal against well-entrenched British regulars, the general proposed a complex flanking maneuver that would catch the enemy completely off guard. The strategy required precise coordination between multiple columns, moving through difficult terrain in the dead of winter while maintaining absolute secrecy. As the Continental Army prepared for what many believed would be their final gamble, Washington addressed his officers with characteristic resolve. He emphasized that this battle would determine not just their immediate survival, but the very future of American independence. The British had grown complacent, believing that winter weather would prevent any serious military operations. This assumption would prove to be their critical error, as Washington was about to demonstrate that desperate times demanded desperate measures. Regardless of season or circumstance, the 2nd of January, 1777, found Washington's army in a precarious position near Trenton. British reinforcements under General Lord Charles Cornwallis had arrived with over 8,000 troops, threatening to crush the Continental forces against the Delaware River. As darkness fell, the British commander confidently told his officers that they would bag the fox in the morning, referring to Washington with dismissive certainty. Unknown to Cornwallis, the American general was already implementing one of the most brilliant tactical deceptions in military history. Washington's plan required splitting his forces into two main columns while leaving a skeleton force to maintain campfires and create the illusion of a full encampment. The deception was crucial, as any premature discovery of the American movement would result in disaster. Captain Alexander Hamilton, serving as Washington's aide-de-camp, later described the tension of those hours as the army prepared to abandon their positions under cover of darkness. The wheels of artillery pieces were wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, and strict orders were given against any unnecessary noise that might alert British sentries. The main force, numbering approximately 2,400 men, began their march along the Quaker Road toward Princeton at midnight. The route had been carefully selected to avoid British patrols, while taking advantage of the frozen ground that would support the movement of heavy artillery. General Nathaniel Greene commanded the left column, while General John Sullivan led the right, with Washington accompanying the center. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, creating treacherous conditions that tested the endurance of men already weakened by months of hardship. As referenced in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study Washington's Crossing, the march toward Princeton represented one of the most challenging logistical operations. Undertaken by the Continental Army, the soldiers moved in single file along narrow country roads, their path illuminated only by occasional moonlight filtering. Through bare winter trees, many men lacked proper footwear, leaving bloody tracks in the snow that marked their passage. Despite these hardships, discipline remained remarkably strong, with officers constantly moving along the column to ensure that no one fell behind or broke ranks. The American advance was facilitated by local guides who knew every path and byway in the region. These men, mostly farmers and tradesmen who had thrown their lot in with the revolutionary cause, provided invaluable intelligence about British dispositions and patrol routes. Their knowledge allowed Washington to avoid the main roads where enemy forces might be encountered, instead following a circuitous route that added miles to the march but greatly reduced the risk of premature discovery. By dawn, the Continental Army had covered nearly 12 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in New Jersey. The men were exhausted, cold, and hungry, but their spirits remained high due to the recent victory at Trenton. Washington had timed the movement perfectly, arriving at the outskirts of Princeton just as the sun began to rise on January 3rd. The British garrison, believing themselves secure in their winter quarters, had no idea that 2,400 American soldiers were about to descend upon them in what would become one of the most decisive flanking maneuvers of the Revolutionary War. The first rays of sunlight on January 3rd, 1777, revealed a pastoral scene that belied the violence about to unfold. Princeton's snow-covered streets lay quiet in the early morning calm. With British soldiers still asleep in their quarters after a night of routine guard duty, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mohood, commanding the garrison, had no reason to suspect that danger approached from the northwest, where Washington's columns were already deploying for their surprise assault. The Continental Army's approach had been masterfully concealed by the rolling terrain around Princeton. Washington positioned his forces to take maximum advantage of the high ground overlooking the town, while ensuring that his artillery could command the key roads leading to New Brunswick and Trenton. The general's tactical plan called for a coordinated attack from multiple directions, designed to confuse the British defenders and prevent any organized resistance. Speed and surprise would be crucial, as the Americans could not afford a prolonged engagement against professional troops fighting from prepared positions. Captain Alexander Hamilton commanded a battery of artillery that had been positioned on the Mercer Heights, overlooking the main approach to Princeton. From this vantage point, American gunners could sweep the streets with devastating fire while supporting the infantry advance. The young officer had proven himself during the crossing of the Delaware, and Washington entrusted him with this critical mission. Hamilton's battery included several experienced artillerists who had served with distinction throughout the campaign, their skill compensating for the inferior quality of their equipment. The first British troops to encounter the American advance were a patrol of light infantry under Captain William Scott, who had been conducting a routine reconnaissance toward Trenton. These soldiers stumbled upon the head of Washington's column near the Quaker Meeting House, approximately 2 miles from Princeton proper. The ensuing skirmish alerted the British garrison to the American presence, but it was already too late to organize an effective defense. Scott's men were quickly overwhelmed, with the captain himself being mortally wounded in the brief engagement, as documented in the Pennsylvania Gazette's contemporary account. The sound of musket fire near the meeting house created immediate confusion. Within Princeton, British officers attempted to rally their men, but the surprise had been complete, and many soldiers were still emerging from their quarters when American forces began entering the town from multiple directions. The 40th Regiment of Foot, which formed the core of Mahood's garrison, managed to deploy in some semblance of order, but they found themselves facing a coordinated assault that had been planned with meticulous attention to detail. Washington himself led the central column as it approached Princeton College, where British forces had established a strong point. The general's presence at the front of the attack inspired his men and demonstrated the importance he placed on this engagement. His white horse and distinctive uniform made him an obvious target for British marksmen, but Washington seemed oblivious to the danger, focused entirely on ensuring that his carefully orchestrated plan succeeded. The fate of the revolution might well depend on the next few hours, as American forces prepared to test themselves against some of Britain's finest soldiers in what would become a defining moment of the war. The brilliance of Washington's tactical plan became fully apparent as his forces executed the flanking movement that would give the battle its decisive character. While British attention was focused on the apparent American approach from the southwest, Washington had positioned his strongest units to strike from the northwest, where the terrain offered both concealment and tactical advantage. This maneuver, years later studied in military academies across Europe, demonstrated the Continental Army's growing sophistication under Washington's leadership. General Hugh Mercer, commanding the advance guard, led his men through a dense stand of woods that provided perfect cover for the flanking movement. The Virginia veteran had served with Washington during the French and Indian War, and his experience in wilderness fighting proved invaluable in navigating the difficult terrain. Mercer's force included some of the Continental Army's most reliable troops, men who had endured the hardships of the retreat across New Jersey and emerged with their fighting spirit intact. Their objective was to seize the bridge over Stony Brook, cutting off the British line of retreat toward New Brunswick. The surprise achieved by this flanking movement was complete and devastating. British forces, expecting any American attack to come along the main roads, found themselves assaulted from an unexpected direction by troops who had moved through terrain considered impassable for organized military units. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, despite his professional competence, had been caught completely off guard by Washington's tactical innovation. The British commander attempted to reorganize his scattered forces, but the momentum of the American assault could not be stopped. Captain Hamilton's artillery battery played a crucial role in supporting the flanking maneuver. From their position on the high ground, the American gunners could observe the entire battlefield and direct their fire with devastating accuracy. The British had no comparable artillery support, having positioned their guns to defend against attacks from the expected directions. This gave the Americans a significant advantage, as their artillery could suppress British defensive positions while their infantry advanced through the fields and orchards surrounding Princeton. The psychological impact of the flanking movement on British morale was immediate and profound. Professional soldiers who had been trained to fight in linear formations found themselves under attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The carefully drilled maneuvers that had made British infantry famous throughout Europe became liabilities in the face of Washington's innovative tactics. Many British soldiers, convinced that they were surrounded by vastly superior numbers, began to break ranks and retreat toward New Brunswick, as chronicled in the New York Mercury's detailed coverage of the engagement. The success of Washington's flanking maneuver demonstrated the Continental Army's evolution from a collection of amateur militia into a professional fighting force capable of executing complex tactical operations. The general's ability to coordinate multiple columns over difficult terrain while maintaining operational security showed a level of military competence that surprised both his enemies and his European observers. The flanking movement at Princeton would become a textbook example of how inferior forces could defeat superior enemies through tactical innovation and superior leadership. Washington's personal leadership during the flanking movement inspired his men to extraordinary efforts. The general rode constantly between his units, ensuring that the timing of the assault remained coordinated and that no opportunity was lost. His presence at critical moments boosted American morale, while demonstrating to the British that they faced a commander of exceptional ability. The success of the flanking maneuver would prove decisive in achieving victory at Princeton and revitalizing the revolutionary cause. The British defense of Princeton began to crumble as Washington's flanking maneuver reached its climax. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, recognizing that his position had become untenable, attempted to execute a fighting withdrawal toward New Brunswick, where he could link up with the main British force under General Howe. However, the speed and coordination of the American assault had disrupted British communications and command structure, making any organized retreat extremely difficult. Individual units found themselves isolated and surrounded, fighting desperately to avoid capture or annihilation. The 40th Regiment of Foot, which had formed the backbone of Princeton's garrison, fought with the professional discipline expected of British regular troops. These soldiers, veterans of European campaigns, attempted to maintain their formation. While under attack from multiple directions, their training served them well in the initial phases of the engagement. But the sheer audacity of Washington's assault eventually overwhelmed their defensive capabilities. The regiment's colors, symbol of their honor and tradition, became the focus of desperate hand-to-hand combat as American forces closed in on their position. General Mercer's advance guard bore the brunt of the British counterattack as Mohud's forces attempted to break through the American encirclement. The fighting in the orchard near the Quaker Meeting House was particularly fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Mercer himself was mortally wounded during this phase of the battle, struck down by British bayonets as he attempted to rally his men. The loss of this experienced commander could have been catastrophic, but Washington's tactical plan had anticipated such contingencies. With predetermined lines of succession ensuring continued coordination, the American artillery under Captain Hamilton continued to dominate the battlefield, their guns positioned to command every avenue of British retreat. The young officer had learned his trade during the siege of Boston, and his battery's performance at Princeton demonstrated the Continental Army's growing expertise in the use of artillery. British attempts to silence the American guns failed repeatedly, as Hamilton had positioned his pieces to provide mutual support while remaining protected from direct assault. The devastating effect of concentrated artillery fire on British formations was a lesson that would influence American tactics throughout the remainder of the war, as documented in the Boston Gazette's contemporary reporting. The collapse of British resistance at Princeton was as much psychological as physical. The shock of Washington's surprise attack, combined with the realization that they were facing a more competent enemy than previously believed, shattered British confidence. Many soldiers who had viewed the Continental Army as little more than armed rabble were forced to confront the reality of professional military opposition. The speed with which their defensive positions had been overrun demonstrated that the Americans had learned from their earlier defeats and emerged as a formidable fighting force. The final phase of the British collapse centered on Nassau Hall, the main building of Princeton College, where a remnant of Mohud's force had taken refuge. This imposing structure, built of sturdy stone, offered excellent defensive possibilities. But the British lacked the numbers and supplies necessary. For a prolonged siege, American forces surrounded the building and brought up their artillery to breach the walls if necessary. The sight of cannon being wheeled into position convinced the remaining British defenders that further resistance was futile. They displayed a white flag of surrender. Washington's tactical masterpiece had achieved complete success. The flanking maneuver that had begun in the pre-dawn darkness had culminated in the total defeat of Princeton's British garrison. The psychological impact of this victory would prove even more significant than the tactical success. As news of Washington's triumph spread throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic to European capitals where the struggle for American independence was being watched with growing interest, the immediate aftermath of Washington's triumph at Princeton revealed the full scope of his tactical achievement. British resistance had collapsed so completely that American forces found themselves in possession of not only the town, but also substantial military stores that the enemy had been unable to evacuate. Warehouses filled with provisions, ammunition, and equipment provided the Continental Army with desperately needed supplies, while the capture of artillery pieces strengthened Washington's firepower for future engagements. The material gains from the victory were significant, but the psychological impact would prove even more valuable. The speed with which Washington consolidated his victory demonstrated the general's understanding that military success must be immediately exploited to achieve maximum political effect, rather than allowing his exhausted troops to rest in Princeton. Washington ordered an immediate advance toward New Brunswick, where intelligence reports indicated that the British maintained even larger supply depots. The threat of American forces approaching this crucial stronghold forced General Howe to abandon his winter quarters and concentrate his scattered garrisons, effectively ending British control over much of New Jersey. Captain Hamilton's artillery battery, which had played such a crucial role in the victory, was among the first units to push forward toward New Brunswick. The young officer had distinguished himself during the battle. Washington recognized that maintaining the momentum of success required aggressive pursuit of the retreating enemy. However, the exhaustion of the Continental Army after their night march and morning battle eventually forced the general to halt the advance short of New Brunswick. The decision to withdraw to winter quarters in Morristown was strategically sound, as it preserved the army while maintaining pressure on British positions. The impact of Princeton's fall reverberated throughout the British command structure. General Cornwallis, who had been confident of trapping Washington near Trenton, found himself outmaneuvered by an opponent he had seriously underestimated. The British evacuation of their forward positions in New Jersey represented a significant strategic retreat, abandoning territory that had been considered securely held. More importantly, the defeat at Princeton shattered the myth of British invincibility that had sustained Loyalist morale throughout the Middle Colonies, as reported in the Virginia Gazette's extensive coverage. The victory at Princeton had immediate effects on Continental Army recruitment and colonial morale. Men who had been reluctant to enlist in what seemed a hopeless cause now flocked to Washington's standards. Inspired by proof that the professional British Army could be defeated through superior tactics and leadership. The general's reputation, which had suffered during the retreat across New Jersey, was not only restored, but enhanced by his demonstration of tactical brilliance. European military observers began to take serious notice of American capabilities, some recognizing that the colonial rebellion had evolved into a genuine war of independence. The strategic implications of Washington's flanking maneuver at Princeton extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. The victory demonstrated that the Continental Army had matured into a professional force, capable of executing complex operations against experienced opponents. British commanders were forced to acknowledge that they faced a more dangerous enemy than previously believed, leading to significant changes in their strategic planning. The confidence gained by American forces at Princeton would sustain them through the difficult campaigns ahead. While the defeat convinced many colonists that independence was not only desirable, but achievable. The prisoners taken at Princeton provided valuable intelligence about British dispositions and future plans. Many of these captured soldiers, impressed by the humane treatment they received from their American captors, became sources of information about enemy morale and capabilities. Washington's policy of treating prisoners with respect, in contrast to British practices, helped undermine enemy morale while strengthening American claims to legitimacy as a civilized nation fighting for independence. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Princeton established George Washington as one of the foremost military commanders of his generation. The flanking maneuver that had achieved such decisive results became a model studied by military theorists across Europe who recognized that traditional linear tactics were inadequate against opponents willing to embrace innovative approaches. Washington's ability to coordinate multiple columns over difficult terrain, while maintaining operational security, showed a level of military sophistication that surprised foreign observers who had dismissed American capabilities. The psychological transformation of the Continental Army following Princeton was as significant as any tactical achievement. Soldiers who had endured months of retreat and defeat now possessed confidence in their abilities and their leadership. The successful execution of Washington's complex battle plan demonstrated that American forces could outthink and outfight their professional opponents when properly led and equipped. This confidence would prove crucial during the difficult campaigns that lay ahead, as the Continental Army faced continued challenges from superior British resources and training. The international implications of Washington's victory at Princeton were profound and far-reaching. European powers that had been reluctant to support what appeared to be a hopeless colonial rebellion began to reconsider their positions. The tactical brilliance displayed by American forces suggested that the Continental Army was evolving into a professional military organization capable of sustained resistance against British power. French observers in particular noted that Washington's innovative tactics and strategic vision might provide the foundation for a successful war of independence. The strategic impact of Princeton extended throughout the Revolutionary War. British commanders were forced to adopt more cautious approaches in response to Washington's demonstrated tactical abilities. The flanking maneuver that had achieved such success at Princeton became a standard element of Continental Army operations, adapted to different terrain and circumstances, but always emphasizing surprise and coordination. British forces found themselves constantly concerned about potential American flanking movements, limiting their operational flexibility and reducing their confidence in defensive positions. The victory at Princeton also established important precedents for American military doctrine that would influence the nation's approach to warfare for generations. Washington's emphasis on mobility, surprise, and innovative tactics over traditional European methods became hallmarks of American military thinking. The successful integration of artillery, infantry, and cavalry in the flanking maneuver demonstrated the importance of combined arms operations that would characterize American military success in future conflicts. The personal leadership qualities that Washington displayed during the Princeton campaign became legendary among his contemporaries and established the foundation for his later political career. His ability to inspire confidence in desperate circumstances, combined with his tactical brilliance and strategic vision, created a reputation that would serve him well as the nation's first president. The flanking maneuver at Princeton demonstrated that Washington possessed not only courage and determination, but also the intellectual capabilities necessary for high command in modern warfare in the broader context of the Revolutionary War. The Battle of Princeton represented a crucial turning point that revitalized the American cause when it appeared on the verge of collapse. Washington's flanking maneuver had achieved far more than a tactical victory. It had demonstrated that American independence was not only possible, but probable, with proper leadership and strategy. The legacy of Princeton would inspire American military commanders for centuries, proving that innovative tactics and bold leadership could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The flanking movement that began in the pre-dawn darkness of January 3, 1777, had changed the course of history and established the foundation for American independence.